Hey everybody, and welcome to Bible class. John chapter 19 is our text. I would love for you to meet me there. By the time we are done with John 19, we will hear Jesus say, "It is finished." It is finished is an important thing for us to turn over in our minds. Where has all of this been driving? What is finished? We'll dig into that together as a class. We left Jesus last Sunday in front of the Roman governor Pilate. And in John chapter 19, verse 1, we read about Pilate having Jesus flogged, having him beaten. This is a tough chapter for us to read as we watch the Son of God be treated horribly. In verse 2, we read about Roman soldiers twisting together a crown of thorns and putting it on his head and arraying him in a purple robe and mocking him. "Hail, King of the Jews," and then striking him with their hands. After all of that has happened, verse 4, Pilate goes out again and says to this crowd of Jewish authorities, "See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Do you hear that? The Roman governor has found no guilt in Jesus from Nazareth. So Jesus comes out wearing the crown of thorns and this purple robe. Pilate says to them, "Behold the man." But when the chief priests and the officers see him, they cry out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate says, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." But the Jews tell Pilate, "We have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." When Pilate hears that, he's afraid. Even more afraid than he has been. So he goes back into the headquarters and he says to Jesus, "Where are you from?" Jesus doesn't give him an answer. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" To which Jesus answers, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Even now more, Pilate is seeking to release him, but there are Jews outside of the headquarters crying out, "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend." Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out, sat down on the judgment seat, and listened to what happens. He says to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cry out, "Away with him, away with him, crucify him." Pilate says, "Shall I crucify your king?" And the chief priest answers, "We have no king but Caesar." Pilate has to make a choice. So he delivers Jesus over to them to be crucified. They take him, verse 17, bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucify him with two others, one on either side, with Jesus in between. And Pilate writes an inscription, puts it on the cross. It reads, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. John tells us that there are some Jews there who read this inscription and they tell Pilate, don't write the King of the Jews. Rather, this man said, I am King of the Jews. Pilate answers, what I have written, I have written. In verse 23, when the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his garments, they divided it into 4 parts, one for each soldier, also his tunic. But the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see whose it shall be. And John reminds us, long before it had been prophesied, they divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Where did that come from? We'll talk about that a little bit more as a class. The soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, behold your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there. So they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Since it was the day of preparation, and so that the bodies would not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and that they might be taken away. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and they saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. He who saw it has borne witness. Remember, we have noticed over and over again, John is writing as an eyewitness. John was there at the cross. His testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth. What has been his mission all along in what he has told us? That we also might believe. For these things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. Not one of his bones will be broken. And again, another scripture says, they will look on him whom they have pierced. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus. And Pilate gave him permission. So he came and took away his body. Someone else was there, whose name we've heard before, Nicodemus. Where have we run across him? We'll revisit that as a class. He had come and bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 75 pounds in weight. He and Joseph take the body of Jesus. They bind it in linen cloths with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. In the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden, a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid. So because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. I want you to think about what we have heard. It is finished. What was finished? We've heard a lot about the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies. Why does that matter? And what do we need to understand about Jesus dying and being buried? What does that mean for us today? How does it help us believe the way John is helping us believe? Thanks so much for being in class today. Let's make it a great rest of our class together.